and outlets such as the New Republic, Truth Out, Academe, Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, and Ms. She's the author of one book and co-author of two, The Humanities, Higher Education, and Academic Freedom, Three Necessary Arguments, and It's Not Free Speech, Race, Democracy, and the Future of Academic Freedom. Those books are co-written with Michael Berube. She's also the co-editor with Valerie Johnson and Ellen Schrechter of The Right to Learn, Resisting the Right-Wing War on Academic Freedom. So I hope you can see that we're in for a treat, being able to listen to these two people converse about an issue that often doesn't make the headlines, but is of the utmost importance to those of us who care about the future of higher education, university boards. So Tim and Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you. And I'm so happy to see everyone here. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having us, Lisa, and Scholars for a New Deal in Higher Education. So I think I'm going to begin, and I think that we really want to do justice to Timothy's book, The Autocratic Academy, which was written before our more recent exposure of the degree to which boards of trustees, boards, councils, whatever they're called, boards of advisees, depending on where you are, have inordinate power over universities without it being quite known or understood, and maybe in the past not always as overtly exercised as it has been lately, or maybe also then exercised overtly in ways that we weren't aware of. But that has been exposed. But Timothy wrote this book before, say, the December 23rd hearings when Claudine Gay, Liz McGill, Sally Kornbluth were interrogated by the likes of Elise Stefanik and then later removed from their roles by their boards. Or he wrote this book before this. So this has been a kind of bomb that's been waiting to happen in a sense, or has happened in smaller ways before. So we really want to hear from Timothy about his book, what prompted him to write it, how he understands where we went wrong, where faculty in particular went wrong in terms of having some kind of ownership over our universities or corporate ownership. So I'm just going to begin actually with, we have a set of questions that we're going to use to facilitate our conversation. And I'm going to begin with a little bit from, I wrote a review about the Autocratic Academy for Academe, I don't know, about a year or so ago. And I opened it by saying, whose university? Our university is a popular slogan at campus protests. But Timothy Kaufman-Osborn, there's a clear answer to the question of who owns universities, plainly written in bylaws: the boards, trustees, the regents, visitors, and so on. Boards have power over bean counting administrators, and they have a power over faculty and students. They have, in fact, complete power. So we may qualify that a little bit, or we may not. But let me start with my first question for Timothy, which is, again, this was researched and written before that we even the president of Harvard could be removed by a board. And we saw the inordinate power that boards have up close. So what actually prompted you to write the book?
So before I get to that question, I think the most important thing I'm going to say today is this. Thank you so much to Lisa for asking me to speak today and for organizing this event. And thank you, Jennifer, for agreeing to pose some questions that I'll try to answer as best I can. The book was also really written, it was written early in the pandemic. And so it was really, in a sense, written pre-Ron DeSantis as well. And if I were to write it again, that would require some modifications to my argument that maybe we can talk about later. But this book really grew out of my experience as a faculty member at a small private liberal arts college, Whitman College, and then later as an administrator at the same institution. Let me explain a little bit. During the first quarter century or so of my employment, no doubt naively, I construed my relationship to the college first and foremost in terms of my work with other faculty members. And no matter what power differentials distinguished us, whether based in tenure tracks, status, rank, race, gender, I nonetheless imagine my relationship to fellow faculty members and hence my situation within the college, principally in what we might call horizontal as opposed to vertical terms. And I think it's that conception that we refer to or presuppose when we speak of one another as colleagues and when we regard ourselves as peers within a self-governing community of professional educators. That self-understanding was completely disrupted when, much to my surprise, in 2006, I was appointed provost. And it was during my 6 years in that position that I came to think of the college in fundamentally different terms. And those terms are readily apparent from any standard university organization chart. I'm sure you've all seen them. They typically are shaped in the form of something akin to a pyramid. At the pyramid's apex, we find the board of trustees or its equivalent. Beneath that body, we see the board's principal executive appointee, the president. Below the president, we see the senior administrative officers who are responsible for discharging the orders issued by those above them within this hierarchical chain of command, and so forth and so on. So that disjunction between my 25 years of imagining myself in horizontal terms, right, as colleagues, as opposed to the highly bureaucratized hierarchical structure of authority that I found myself inserted in as provost, led me to ask a fairly simple question. Why is it that Whitman College, like virtually every other nonprofit institution of secondary education, post-secondary education in the United States, private as well as public, vests the ultimate authority to rule in what are often called external lay governing boards? And the term external refers to the fact that governing board members are not employees of the institutions they rule, and the term lay suggests that one need not be a professional educator to qualify for appointment to these boards. A less generous way to put the point would be to say that America's universities are ruled by amateur volunteers. So how, I wondered, while sitting in a board meeting one afternoon, how did this curious structure of rule come to prevail within US universities? What's its history? What's its genealogy? Moreover, why should we be convinced that this is the best way to govern the academy if our aim is to advance the unique purposes of higher education? And finally, if there's good reason to think that that way of organizing rule has not served free inquiry, the purposes of the academy well, is it possible to imagine better ways of governing America's universities? And that's a very concrete experience out of which the book ultimately arose.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And it makes total sense that once you are in an administrative position, you see how the university is in fact quite hierarchical, and you see it quite differently. So one of the things that the American Association of University Professors worked out in order to try to buy some freedom, some academic autonomy from external interference, whether that be people, corporations outside the university, whether that be external lay member board of trustee types, whether that be politicians, was the creation of the infrastructure of tenure and the idea that faculty should be able to bite the hand that feeds them, essentially. But you point out the kind of fatal flaw in this kind of makeshift way of gaining some freedom for faculty to pursue knowledge without interference. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and the fatal flaw that, although I talk about tenure quite a bit in the book, the fatal flaw that more fundamentally concerns me is the one we call shared governance. And the critique of shared governance that I try to offer in the book is in effect an attempt to think my way through a puzzle. And the puzzle goes something like this, and I'm sure a lot of you read this. In 2021, the AUP issued a report titled COVID-19 and Academic Governance. And in that report, the AUP rightly detailed egregious violations of what it calls shared governance at 8 different institutions. And those violations included termination of tenured as well as non-tenured faculty, the suspension of faculty handbooks, the elimination of entire academic programs, and more. And toward the end of that report, the AUP draws a pretty dire conclusion. And I just want to read one sentence from it. I'm quoting, "The COVID-19 pandemic has presented the most serious challenges to academic governance in the last 50 years, unquote. And then peering into the future, the report's authors expressed their fear that what they call unilateral fiat may become a permanent, again quoting, a permanent element of institutional governance. So how are they going to respond to this fear? Well, to arrest the Academy's slide into authoritarianism, the AUP offers what I'm going to call a plea in the form of a platitude. And here's the way it goes. I'm quoting again from the report. Governing boards, administrations, and faculties must make a conscious, concerted, and sustained effort to ensure that all parties are conversant with and cultivate respect for the norms of shared governance, unquote. My guess is that most of us read that sentence and nod our heads in agreement. But my initial response was incredibly, what's going on here is that the AUP is urging the very trustees and senior managers who have demonstrated their penchant for ruling by high-handed edict to basically concede the error of their ways and now affirm allegiance to norms they've been busy undermining for decades. So how are we to make sense of this disjuncture between the AUP's bleak account of the Academy's current plight and what I'm going to call its Pollyannish prescription for its recovery? And on my reading, the AUP's incoherence stems from its failure to call into question the Academy's basic constitution of rule. And I think that you can track that failure all the way back to the 1915 Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure, which in effect is the AUP's founding document. And there the AUP states this, and I'm going to read two sentences here because they're important. The AUP in 1915 wrote, American institutions of learning are usually controlled by boards of trustees as the ultimate repositories of power. Upon them, the declaration proceeds, and I think this is really important. Upon them, it devolves the governing boards. It devolves to determine the measure of academic freedom, which is to be realized in the several institutions, unquote. And here, I think what the AUP does is basically accepts as a given the received structure of rule within America's universities. And of course, it's that same structure that enabled the governing board censured by the AUP in 2021 to rule as they will. And I became convinced as I was working on the book that that way of structuring power, the power of rule, until it is criticized, contested, and ultimately repudiated, I think the AUP's impasse is going to be ours as well. One other quick note on that front. What the AUP offers its members in lieu of collective self-rule is, as we all know, what it calls shared governance. And in the last analysis, this is a little hyperbolic, but in the last analysis, given the formal legal constitution of the U.S. Academy, the faculty's authority to participate in institutional rule is a form of delegated and therefore revocable power. And when push comes to shove, as it did during the pandemic, as it did during the McCarthy era, as it has several previous eras, that power on the part of faculty proves to be little more than an opportunity to advise the Academy's rulers, or instead to offer after the fact protests when that counsel is ignored. So that's why that explains the title of this event, right? Shared Governance, a bet gone bad. And it's a bet that goes back over 100 years.
Right. And I don't think that's hyperbolic at all. When you were in the midst of writing it, perhaps many people didn't understand this, how sort of flawed our structure is and how flimsy and actually non-existent shared governance actually is, how it's a kind of gentleman's agreement that once you don't have gentlemen in power, that doesn't need to be honored in any way at all. I think, you know, there was complaining, there was bitterness around, oh, is it really shared governance? But there was still that use, that sort of ubiquitous use of that phrase. There was also the big ubiquitous use of neoliberal administrators. That's who we blamed for everything. So you were really prescient in seeing how huge a problem this is and quickly became after your book was published. There was one really heartening thing. Well, and I think also you mentioned a number of places where shared governance, it can be revoked and it can be ruled by fiat. Another place I think where that has sort of, we've been quickly exposed to this power dynamic in the last year, but we were slowly being exposed to it all along with the resort to contingent labor positions for faculty and faculty's inability to sort of staunch that hemorrhage of tenure track positions. I think that kind of showed something about, I think often, more often than not, and I'm guilty of this too, it was a kind of frustration with one another and with tenured faculty's unwillingness to fight that battle for contingent faculty. But there's a real question, I think, that's raised by your book, whether we had all that much power to fight it in the first place. It's unclear. I mean, there's things we could have done and should have done, no question, but it's still unclear. There was one chapter that I really, really enjoyed in your book, and that was the chapter where you talk about the literature of protest, professors' literature of protest. Can you tell people about that genre, if you will, and what they were arguing?
So these folks I stumbled across quite by accident when I came across James Cattell's book called University Governance, which was published in 1913. And I stumbled across it in a bookstore, and it sent me off on a path that I never expected to go. What we see in the last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first decade and a half, really until the AUP is formally founded in 1915, what we see in that 35-year period or so is the emergence of a group of academics who challenge the American Academy's rule by external lay governing boards. And the names of most of the contributors to what came to be known as the Professors' Literature Protest have mostly been forgotten, but in my view, they deserve better. And the contributors to this literature were ultimately defeated. Ironically, they were defeated by the more conservative founders of the AUP. To their credit, many contributors to the Professors' Literature Protest insisted that the American university's autocratic constitution must be challenged. And importantly, they were doing so in the context of the birth of a new institutional form of higher education in the United States, the birth of the modern research university, the land-grant universities and some of the more elite institutions on the East Coast. And so I think they really saw as this new institutional form was being consolidated with graduate programs and so forth and so on, that there was an opportunity to challenge, to contest the existing regime, if you will. So again, many took issue with what I call the university's autocratic constitution. Some of the contributors to this literature also contended that the construction of faculty work as a form of at-will employment must be challenged as well, because that, of course, was the norm at the turn of the 20th century, prior to tenure gaining its foothold, however insecure that proved to be. So the AUP, of course, attempts to temper the arbitrariness inherent within at-will employment, as you mentioned, Jennifer, by arguing in favor of tenure. But as we're now seeing at multiple institutions, tenure's very existence is itself subject to the prerogative power of governing boards, or in some cases, boards acting at the behest of state legislatures. In any event, the more radical contributors to the Professors' Literature Protest argued that if we're serious about free inquiry, and in particular the model of free inquiry that was emerging in conjunction with research universities around the turn of the 20th century, a lot of them said if we're serious about safeguarding the conduct of free inquiry, we will never be able to do so within the context of an autocratic structure of rule organized in accordance with capitalist employment contracts. And what several proposed, much to my surprise, was the university's reformation as something akin to a self-governing republic of scholars. And on that model, those who exercise the authority to rule are those who have been selected by and remain accountable to the ruled, and the relationship of boss to hired hand is supplanted by a shared identity as equal members of a community whose democratic constitution mirrors the conduct of scholarly inquiry among peers, among colleagues. And at its inception, and I didn't understand this until I was working on the book. At its inception, the AOP could have argued on behalf of that model of the university. There were serious arguments being made to that effect. There was also the emergence of a sort of university populism in the Midwest, in Nebraska, Kansas, and elsewhere. That offered another model. There was also those who argued that the AUP must become something akin to a labor union. But the AUP rejected all those models and adopted instead what I call a strategy of accommodation. And having accommodated themselves to the existing order, they then sought to secure academic freedom, as well as a vital role for faculty and institutional governance within the confines of that order to which they have just accommodated themselves. And that choice involved accepting final control over colleges and universities by representatives of corporate, and I would say now financialized capitalism, but then seeking limited concessions from governing boards whose members are ill-equipped to appreciate the distinctive work of the academy. And today, and this builds off something else you said, Jennifer, today as colleges and universities grow ever more authoritarian in their rule, and as the professoriate is reduced to an army of contingent laborers, I think we're seeing the long-term results of that bad choice. And again, that's why I'm convinced, I have become convinced that the American Academy is never going to provide an adequate home for free inquiry unless we ask some really fundamental questions about the way it organizes the power of rule.
Yeah, I'm convinced, absolutely. And it couldn't be more obvious how we're paying for that strategy of accommodation now, and the fact that accommodation or compromise or makeshift is going to take some real, as you say, fundamental rethinking, reorganizing, building the university on a different model. But before we get to that, I want to stay on track to make sure that we have time for the audience to ask questions. You know, I had mentioned in the beginning that we talked that people were blaming neoliberal administrators or these different kinds of groups for the ills of what we were seeing happen, the defunding of the state from the state universities, et cetera, or the rise of adjunctification, neoliberal administrators. We also, the phrase, the corporatization of the university was a very ubiquitous phrase, still is to some extent, but was very ubiquitous for a while. And you take issue with that, and you have a different model of corporatizing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, just a couple words about why I have grown wary of the all-purpose and hence empty epithet of corporatization. I think it signals our dislike for the latest reprehensible policy adopted by our employers, but I don't think the term provides very much analytic clarity about just what we're objecting to, let alone how we might go about challenging it. Second, the term corporatization includes the fact that most colleges and universities in the United States are legally organized as corporations. That was a surprise to me when I started doing the research. I did not know that. Or in many cases, public universities are organized as what might be called quasi-corporations insofar as they possess the legal powers exercised by corporations, but are not formally constituted as independent juridical persons. So what exactly is the nature of the corporate type that's exemplified by most American colleges and universities? And just very quickly, because I think it's illustrative, but also emblematic of what you would find if you were to look at the governance documents of your own institution. Here's just a word about the constitution of the college where I worked for 40 years. 1883, the Legislative Assembly issues a charter. That charter creates a corporation. The prescribed purpose of that corporation is to instruct, quote, both sexes in literature, science, and art, unquote. The name given to that corporation was and remains the Board of Trustees of Whitman College, and its membership, the membership of that corporation, consists of the 9 persons named in that charter, as well as their successors. And to this incorporated entity, the territorial legislature granted the usual panoply of powers that we grant to corporations, the power to buy, sell, possess property, to enter into contracts, so forth and so on. But for my purposes, the most important power that the 1883 charter conveyed to the college assumes this form. I'm quoting: "The Board of Trustees shall have power to make and put in force such bylaws and regulations as shall from time to time be necessary for the government of said corporation." I really want to lean on the political character of that language, right? The Academy is a political institution in the sense that it's a constitution of rule in a particular way. So to fully appreciate the specifically autocratic character of this corporation, let's recall who its members are. Its members are its trustees, who therefore are not members of this corporation. And the answer to that question is, I think, obvious, but not often noted. Whether president, dean, instructor, custodian, those who are not this corporation's members are those who perform work in return for a wage in accordance with the terms that are designated in a labor contract. In other words, all who are not members are this corporation's employees. I would argue that they are employees, but should also be classified as subjects of an autocratic regime. And if that's the case, right, I do want to suggest that we hold that political status in addition to the economic status of employees. So there's a kind of double and interlocking structure of subordination that I think defines the American Academy. And again, I think it's time to mount a frontal assault on a relic whose roots can be traced back to colonial America. You can find it in Harvard, William and Mary, Dartmouth, so forth and so on. It's time to get rid of that relic, I think. It's had an opportunity to do 400 years of damage. Maybe we'll try something new.
All right, so just to be clear, just to underscore Timothy's point here, the relic is the Board of Trustees. So we need some board abolitionism, I think, these days. So previously I'd asked you about tenure and I'm raising AAUP. Of course, the phrase most often associated with AAUP is academic freedom. And you sort of pivoted to shared governance. And I think part of what really makes your point is the fact that with shared governance, the only real card that faculty had was a vote of no confidence. And as we're seeing today, the only way the vote of no confidence has any power is if it makes the Board of Trustees lose confidence in the president. Otherwise, we've had a flurry of no confidence votes this past year that have not made a whit of difference and have gotten very little press attention. If anything underscores the weakness or the way in which shared governance, as you rightly say, is a platitude more than an actual tool or reality, it's that. The next question I want to ask you about is, is academic freedom. You don't say a lot about it in the book. What does your argument imply about how we should regard the right-wing campaign to gut the distinctive form of freedom that is important for scholarly work?
Yeah, that you're quite right that I use the phrase free inquiry quite often in the book, but I don't talk a lot about academic freedom. And it's been nagging at me ever since the book came out. And so that's what I've been devoting most of my writing time to since then. And what I've concluded thus far is that just as we need to think critically about the constitution of rule within US colleges and universities, I also think we fundamentally need to rethink academic freedom. And that's because the two issues are really inseparable, right? How much academic freedom we enjoy is a function of how the American Academy is ruled. And if the latter is fundamentally flawed, so too is the former. And I won't go into in the interest of time, I won't go into all the detail. Although I'm very excited about it because it's what I've been working on recently, but we're really the heirs of two primary accounts of academic freedom. The first is what might be called or justifications of academic freedom. The first is what's typically called the professional, and that's the account that affirms the freedom of academics to be free of external interference in the conduct of their teaching and research, because as experts in our disciplines, we scholars are exclusively qualified to determine how we should do our work. I think that's at the heart of the professional conception. The second account, which developed more recently, really developed in the 1950s and 60s is what we might call the constitutional, and that's the account that tries to ground freedom of academic inquiry from external interference in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Both accounts, I think, seek to defend what I'm starting to call the scholar's negative freedom. And by negative freedom, I mean freedom from interference by any source outside the community of scholars. Neither of those two accounts, the professional and the constitutional, I fear, is very well equipped to understand, let alone to defend, what I would call the scholarly community's positive liberty. And by positive liberty, I mean the scholarly community's affirmative capacity to engage in self-governance, and more specifically, its freedom to generate and safeguard the practices like peer review, for example, that regulate the conduct of academic inquiry, right? Academic inquiry is not free. It is a highly constrained, disciplined form of activity. And that's what enables us to say that academic inquiry is able to distinguish knowledge from hokum, for lack of a better term. So I don't think we're very good I don't think we have been very good about figuring out how to defend that affirmative conception of academic freedom that I think presupposes faculty self-governance. And of course, for all the reasons I've indicated before, we can't exercise self-governance because of this little problematic entity called governing boards. So I'm convinced that no theory of academic freedom is going to be adequate unless it asks how faculty are going to secure the power of collective self-governance. That's an indispensable condition of free inquiry. And I think that means that the professoriate, I'm going to regret this dependent clause, but I'm going to throw it in anyhow. The professoriate, especially its declining but tenured elite, must get over its allergic response to talking about the accumulation, distribution, exercise of institutionalized power. To argue for the Academy's reconstruction on the basis of democratic principles, as I try to do, offers one way to think about that conversation, how that conversation might proceed.
Okay,
So the only thing of academic freedom is freedom from external interference.
right.
We will not adequately appreciate its nature.
And the active practices and material practices and active liberty of self-governance, self-governing, peer review, all of the things that actually academic freedom as we understand it, typically from the professional point of view, but it's comprised of. We have to be able to articulate those and take control of them or claim ownership of them. That makes total sense. And my next question is about unions. So I want to ask you about how your sense of democratic self-governance relates to unions and the role, the upsurge in union activity and how you think of it. I just also want to compliment you on this. I'm really excited about this new work that you're doing because I'm often talking about academic freedom, and I'm often distinguishing between the professional or sort of case precedent versus the constitutional or the legal or juridical. And I end up defaulting to the professional because I don't want to hand it over to a judge or a jury that doesn't understand what we do. That's the last place I want it to end up. So I end up defaulting back to the professional in a way that I think that toggling between those two versions or ways of understanding academic freedom has kept me in a kind of trap. So I really appreciate that. Let me ask you a question about unions. So you don't say much about unions in your book, but there's been an upsurge, especially on the part of contingent faculty, of course. Given the argument of the book, how do you regard this development?
Yeah, and most of the book was written before the really dramatic upsurge in unionization on the part of graduate students and contingent faculty in particular. And my short answer to your question was, get back to me in a year and I'll have an adequate answer. But, as I expect everyone here knows, in its early years, the AUP went out of its way to avoid any identification of itself as a labor union. Instead, it identified itself as a professional association akin to the American Medical and the American Bar Associations. And in large part, at least what I've read, seems to suggest that the AUP's eagerness it was eager to affirm the professoriate's distinctly middle-class status and hence its rejection of any identification with manual laborers. And only in recent years, decades, I suppose now, has the AUP rethought its position on unions, and to its credit, it has done so. But I think it did so largely in response to the decimation of the professional professoriate beginning in the 1980s as contingent positions became the norm and tenured faculty an ever diminishing exception to that rule. Within that context, I think the recent formation of unions by faculty is to be celebrated because it provides the organizational basis for collective action, principally on behalf of higher pay, better benefits, and improved working conditions. So all those things I think are splendid and to be aggressively pursued. But I want to ask, is that sufficient for our purposes? Can unions mount a fundamental challenge? Can unions mount a fundamental challenge to the Academy's autocratic constitution? And if so, how? Can collective bargaining provide the foundation, not just for claims to shared governance, but also to the exercise of real power in ruling an academy that's now predicated, predicated on labor's subordination? If our aim is to democratize the university, what limitations are inherent in strategies that rely only on unionization, collective bargaining? And in saying that, I don't mean to disparage in any way the effort to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. I'm simply trying to ask whether it is sufficient for our purposes. And I'm genuinely not sure how to answer the questions that I've just posed. So I would welcome an opportunity to hear others on that point later today.
Okay, so I'm cognizant of the time, so we need to move to the $1 million question, which is kind of, I'm going to raise it in one way. I see John Wallach in the chat is raising another $1 million question that we should also get to. That's related to mine, but the biggest question that the one that you were most prepared for is, okay, how do we do it? How do we abolish the boards and reorganize a democratic self-governing corporation of the campus faculty and workers? How do we do it? How do we do it, Timothy?
Well, that's an easy one. I almost did not write the epilogue to the book, which addresses Jennifer's question, because an epilogue that tries to offer a manifesto, a plan for fundamental reconstruction, just is inviting abuse, sets itself up as a target. But then in a confessional mode, there was the haunting voice of my now deceased mother, who would always say to me, right, well, I understand your criticism, but what do you propose instead? So as a tribute to my mother, I wrote the epilogue, and I think it may have been a bad idea, but I wrote it. So rather than arguing for a repudiation of the Academy's legal formation as a corporation, I suggest that we consider its reformation as a different kind of corporation. And to open a space for that argument, I first have to dislodge our received understanding of what a corporation is, right? Today, when we hear the term corporation, most of us, I think, are likely to think of its for-profit manifestations: Facebook, Exxon, Mobil, Walmart, so forth and so on. And those examples, I think, suggest that when we hear the word corporation, today we think of it as a creature of private actors engaged in the pursuit of self-interested gain within a market economy predicated on private property and contractual exchange. But historically, the corporation has assumed many different forms since it was first imagined in ancient Rome and then perfected in medieval Europe. The for-profit neoliberal variant is a historically contingent artifact that I think should not be permitted to monopolize our understanding of what a corporation is or might be. And the alternative type of corporation that especially interests me is what William Blackstone, the 18th century English jurist, called little republics. And I like it because I like the political terminology there. And what that might look like is the question that I try to answer in the book's epilogue in very sketchy terms. And what I'm commending is something that is sometimes called a member corporation, as opposed to the autocratic variant or the neoliberal variant. And I try to offer a couple of principles that might guide the reconstruction of the autocratic corporation along the lines of a member corporation. And just to mention a couple obvious things, in what I dub Commonwealth University, because I got to give my little creature a name, all who exercise rule, whether president, provost, or even trustee, must be subject to election and removal by the incorporated bodies of this academic body politic. Body politic is a term often used as a synonym for corporation. To check the exercise of arbitrary power, these rulers must be bound by law and the norms of due process. And the members of Commonwealth University, I think, need to adopt a Bill of Rights that guarantees the practice of free inquiry, for example, by expressly ensuring the right to challenge all claims to knowledge. Is that aspiration to reform the American Academy naive and perhaps even utopian, as some have charged? And just here's two quick reasons for thinking maybe, but maybe not. If you look at the statutory codes of, I believe, every state in the United States, and if you look at the nonprofit and corporation statutes of any state, you will find that they provide for member corporations. So the legal instrument is just sitting out there waiting for anyone who wants to transform the autocratic academy into one built on the principles of democratic republicanism. It's easy. Second, intimations of the member corporation are already very much present, albeit in truncated form, within the universities and colleges for which we all now work. Consider the existence of faculty senates. Those faculty senates are vestiges of member corporations that are now unhappily shoehorned within an autocratic legal form. But that form, I think we hide that form's true character, right? The true character of a Senate, as long as we buy into the myth of shared governance. The earliest report that the AUP issued on what comes eventually to be called shared governance appeared in 1920. In that 1920 report, the AUP referred to faculty senates as legislatures. Again, I want to lean on the political term. They insisted that no significant institutional changes should be adopted absent the faculty's consent. Absent that consent, it doesn't happen. Indeed, and I love this line, that 1920 report suggested that the governance role of trustees should be limited to, and I'm quoting, recommending for consideration by the faculty such changes as they, the trustees, deem desirable. And furthermore, that 1920 report goes on to argue that trustees, quote, should be invited to be present and to speak without vote in all university faculty meetings called to discuss general educational policies. So the trustees become a consultative and advisory body to the faculty senate, that holds final legislative authority. In some, and quite unlike the 1966 shared governance document that we routinely cite as gospel, and that a lot of us have now got incorporated into our faculty handbooks, the AUP's 1920 report offers a political and specifically democratic conception of the faculty's role in institutional governance. I think it warrants going back about 100 years. Take a look at that version.
Thank you. Fantastic. And I've been trying to keep an eye on the chat and not doing a great job, but what I have noticed is how informed and interesting the comments are. So we should definitely go to questions and conversation with the audience now. And I think Lisa is going to facilitate this part of the evening.
Yes, please use I think there's a raise your hand function. And we'd love to, first of all, though, thank you. This was incredible. And as a historian, I'm just loving it in particular, but really, this was just an amazing conversation. Bells going off everywhere. And so I'm sure we have some questions. John Wallach, please go ahead, unmute yourself.
So I'll just rephrase what I put in the chat, namely, colleges and universities receive their money from state governments or from large contributors, which create endowments, and they usually want something in return for their money. And the question is, how can republics of scholars withstand the pressures placed on colleges and universities by these external sources of funds, which provide the lifeblood of these institutions, since none can support themselves simply by tuition?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very practical question to which I do not have a splendid response. But what I would say is that let's talk specifically about public universities that owe their funding to primarily, but not exclusively, to state legislatures, right? Because increasingly, public universities are relying on donations and gifts and foundations for their funding, and less so on state governments, as state governments, in the name of austerity, right, have cut back ever since 2008, right, have been cutting back on the funding they've been provided to the public universities. But that's not to diminish your question, John. I do think there are different ways to institutionally structure the relationship between public universities and state legislatures in particular. So, for example, if you were to look at the Constitution and Statutory Code of the state of Arizona, which I've had the pleasure of doing the last couple of days, you will find that the public university system of Arizona is authorization for its creation and governance is vested in the legislature in the state constitution, right? The state constitution basically says the legislature shall create and make provision for public universities. That provides public universities no autonomy whatsoever. They are purely, right, leaving aside external donations, they are highly subject to the will and the whims of state legislatures. They're at the opposite extreme. You find a few states like Michigan and California in particular, where interestingly, if you go looking at their state constitutions, higher education has a separate article in those constitutions. In other words, rather than being subordinated beneath the legislative authority, they stand as something akin to quasi-independent branches of government. And then they are invested in state constitutions, California and Michigan in particular, with the authority to rule their respective institutions. That has given those institutions, and you see this most dramatically in California, the opportunity to push back on state legislatures by refusing some of those encroachments. That doesn't mean that the public universities of California suddenly no longer require public funding from the state, but it does mean that their interventions, their encroachments are limited to fairly formal functions like auditing how the public university funds are being employed, or insisting that particular auditing practices be employed. But as to the internal affairs of the University of California system, at least in principle, the Constitution of the state of California provides those institutions considerable autonomy, independence, and hence capacity to resist state legislatures. That's it would be interesting to ask whether there might be something to be said for mounting a campaign for an amendment to the constitutions of the various states that basically absorb public universities into their legislatures and provide them no independence whatsoever. There have been attempts to do so in a few states, most notably a number of years ago in the state of Florida, of all things. That would fashion the relationship of Ron DeSantis to public universities in a very different fashion, were a constitutional amendment of that sort to be adopted.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Trevor.
Yes, I share in people's praise of this presentation, and I wanted to ask a question that is not quite a devil's advocate question, but gets a little bit close to that territory. Can you describe how your book or how you and your thinking have kind of wrestled with the question of when to use the term autocratic when considering power over public institutions exercised by legislatures versus because the power there is versus worker power, right? Or consumer power, if we're to reduce students to a consumer, or certain kinds of citizen power. But you know, why, if you're sort of speaking to a lay audience, would saying the legislature controlling a public institution, why would that be seen as autocratic and not an alternative form of democratic governance?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Trevor, because you just pointed to one of the things that I'd like to rewrite. There's so many things I would like to rewrite in this damn book at this point in time, and that's one on which I would like to be more careful, although I'm not going to backtrack on my point altogether. I think this may be counterintuitive, the most fully autocratic colleges and universities in the United States today are private colleges and universities. And that's precisely because they are autonomous in their governance functions, and they are self-perpetuating for the most part, in the sense that when seats on a private board of trustees, private college board of trustees come vacant, who fills the vacant seat? It's the existing membership of that private university or college. So I really do think you have a perfection of autocracy in private institutions, even though I think that may run against conventional wisdom. You're quite right to point out that public universities, given their financial dependence, not just financial dependence, but their financial dependence on legislatures, combined with the increasingly intrusive moves made by, for example, Ron DeSantis and his ilk in Florida, to Stop Woke being a good example, right? To basically prohibit faculty from encouraging students to entertain conclusions derived from critical race theory. Or even more egregiously, last year, the legislature in the state of Florida has now effectively imposed certain curricular mandates on Florida's public universities. In other words, they've gone beyond telling faculty you can't talk about these issues, and they have now told faculty in general education courses, these are the things you will talk about. These are the texts you will incorporate in your general studies courses. The Federalist Papers being one of the favorites of favorite forms of curricular intervention. So in that sense, yes, I would want to back off my overly general characterization of all American universities as being autocratic in nature. However, the denominator that is common to public and to private institutions is the unaccountability of rulers to those they rule. In other words, the unaccountability of boards of governors to those who are not members of those corporate entities, and as such are employees. And that fundamental unaccountability that I think you see manifest in the AUP's argument on behalf of shared governance, which I think ultimately reduces to providing counsel that may be heard or may be rejected or may be ignored altogether. The unaccountability of powers exercised to those over whom that power is exercised is, I think, a denominator that's common to public and private universities. And if you'll accept that as a definition of what qualifies as an autocracy, then I'm going to stand by my original claim, even though I'd want to qualify it to death if I had an opportunity to rewrite it now.
Thanks so much for that good question and interesting answer. We have time for one last question. Jennifer Middlestad.
Hi, good evening. And thank you again for this really fantastic discussion. I mean, I just want to say that it strikes me that you know, one of the basic solutions here is that I think there's a way in which many of us, even when we thought we had hints about this, did not fully understand the long legal structure of the power of these boards and the meaning of that for governance, even as we had a sense of some of the unfairness of it, or we felt frustrated with what, you know, the amateur non-expert people who were on the board. And it strikes me that just talking more about this and getting this word out and portraying boards as these profoundly undemocratic spaces. And, you know, now in this moment of crisis on campus, we have the opportunity to showcase how incredibly, you know, small numbers of people are wielding this in an outsized power that is, you know, shocking and detrimental to the members of the community who live, work, study, you know, there. At the same time, I can't help but ask, it seems like there's sort of a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. A long-term one might be to imagine, as some of the people who are on this call are actually doing, things like cooperative education that maybe work on that model of reimagining the legal corporate structure that you're talking about. There might be a model of amending constitutions or changing the laws about the constitution of trustees, as I know Jennifer cited a case in Oregon, right, where someone to try to get a student and a faculty member always represented on the board, for example, like that might be a strategy. Political pressure through state legislatures in the case of public universities that perhaps like unions and others could play a role in. I mean, I'm just looking for, like, you know, in possible inroads at multiple levels for dealing with the unequal power, and just wondering if you yourself have thoughts about which ways to go, or all at once, you know, try them all, throw it all at the wall.
I think, as with most political struggles, I think what we need is a combination of long and short-term strategies. But in terms of the long-term strategies, I think we have to have a vision of what we're trying to accomplish, albeit perhaps way down the road. And I think in order for us to exercise that capacity for imagination, we've got to come to understand that the current structure of rule within America's universities is not a given that must simply be accepted as what John Dewey once called the crust of convention, that it's got a particular history, it's got a highly suspect history going back into the 17th century. It's basically an accident of history that I haven't talked about the founding of Harvard and William and Mary in particular, but they well illustrate the contingent and arbitrary nature and the political nature, right, to strengthen certain elites via the adoption of external lay governments. I think we need to recognize that the structure we are cursed with today is not a given, and that it has a history and that it is challengeable. I think that's the first step toward the long-term strategy. And the short-term strategy, just let me give you one very quick example, again, from my home institution. And it's small, but I don't think it's insignificant. 2 years ago, the Whitman College faculty adopted a process that authorizes its members, faculty members, to conduct periodic reviews every 3 years of the president and provost. And that review is being institutionalized and conducted for the first time this year. The results of those reviews will be shared with those officers, with the president and the provost, as well as with the board of trustees, whether they want it or not. It's going to be in their inboxes. And that process will thereby render the college's leaders at least partly accountable to those they rule. Right? And if so there's a modest step toward accountability of rulers to the ruled. Were Whitman to be wholly reconstituted as member corporation, right, that would simply carry the principle that informs this new policy to its radical, but I think entirely reasonable conclusion. So that's an example of a small, but again, I think not insignificant step.
But doesn't that presume the very thing that you're exposing as not true, which is that the presidents and the provosts are the one who have power, and they are the autocrats? They're not. It's the boards.
And no doubt, board members as well as presidents and provosts know where the delete key is on their computers. And yet, I think the expectation is that these reports, right, these periodic assessments of president and provost will go not merely to those two senior administrators, but also to the trustees, but also to the entire faculty. And once I think it goes to the entire faculty, then I think we've created a more interesting and potentially volatile situation.
For sure.
Possibly puts the faculty in a better position to
Yeah.
raise more fundamental concerns. It's an incremental step. It does.
Well, it changes the balance of power, and it sort of can expose that the emperor has no clothes in a way that might embolden faculty. But one of the things that, if I could just, I know that we're reaching the end of time, but you really stress the contingent nature of the way that we've been formed, and the fact that AUP did a strategy of accommodation and came up with this shared governance and tenure. One thing that AUP has given us, the sort of gift for this moment, is the fact that not only, so you point out the boards are contingent, but there's a way in which, by virtue of the fact that only an engineer can evaluate an engineer's work, only a literary critic can evaluate a literary critic's work, that the professional association model is a way in which most of us have internalized the sense that it's illegitimate for the Board of Trustees to have any say over tenure and who gets tenure, hiring, firing, et cetera. And they actually are the final, we've seen it with Stephen, we've seen it all along. Stephen Salida, right? It gets to the board and all of a sudden we knew it was there, but it was so rarely exposed. Now it's in Florida and elsewhere being so profoundly exposed. So and the Board of Trustees are becoming visible. So to Jennifer's point about one short-term strategy, I just really want to emphasize is, who is your board? I once wrote an academe blog post that says, get to know your board, look up each name. You start to realize, whoa, that, business guy has power over me. What? Who is your board? You find out, for example, if you're at George Mason, that Lindsay Burke, who is the person who wrote the chapter for Project 2025 to abolish the Department of Education, is on the Board of Trustees at George Mason. And so you start to find these, these fools and who have this inordinate power. And I think that also will rally faculty to begin to rethink this and expose the illegitimacy of the structure that we are ruled over by.
And I think what you need to do is look not merely at the names of the persons who are on governing boards, but also their occupations. And if you look at around the turn of the 20th century with the birth of research universities, there was a dramatic shift in the composition of governing boards from political figures, ministerial elites, to corporate tycoons, corporate moguls in the early 20th century. And there's some interesting work being done, and I'm spacing out on his name right now, someone in California, about how increasingly governing boards are being dominated by representatives of financialized capitalism as opposed to industrial capitalism. And that's a very, very significant shift. It's making it harder and harder to track endowments. It means that more and more institutions are becoming involved in very risky alternative investments, right? Hedge funds, private equities, and so forth, where it's not clear to me that they can claim they're doing their financial duty adequately when, as in the case of Oberlin College, where I went as an undergraduate, the private equity investments, the alternative investments are now, I believe, about 60 to 65% of the total endowment. And I would argue that that's a form of gambling with the money that's going to enable Oberlin to persist into the future. So you got to look at the occupational identities as well. More and more institutions are creating chief investment officers, right? Another indication of financialized capitalism. More and more boards, I'm being told informally, are effectively being dominated by their investment committees, that their investment committees in secret come up with recommendations, present them to their respective boards. Their boards don't understand what is being recommended to them and fall over and play dead. Yeah, that's it.
Well, we have our work cut out for us, but thank you for really laying out this so clearly something that has, I know to me, been very obtuse. And this has been an incredibly enlightening discussion. I want to thank our co-sponsors, thank all of the board members, for Scholars for New Deal for Higher Education, for helping to organize this panel, our two incredible speakers for this just incredibly generative, brilliant, really conversation. We will be following up. We'll be sending out an email to let you know how to get the recording if you would like to share it, and about next steps. This has been a really great conversation. We appreciate your support. We appreciate you being here, and we will take this knowledge and keep forging ahead. Thanks to everyone, and good night.
Thank you.